And I must tell you, and I say this to you, and I see you occasionally on Morning Joe. When a reporter from the New York Times or the Washington Post ends up on one of those programs, sitting next to Mika Brzezinski, it's very hard for that reporter at that point to lay claim to absolute objectivity, whether or not anything that he or she says ends up being subjective or ends up being perceived as being in favor of one side or the other. The mere fact that they are on a program that is perceived as being very left of center and very anti-Trump, I think undermines the public perception of those people as being objective.
But don't you think that opinionated journalism is in some ways more honest, that reporters have always had biases, but now at least they get to express their opinions, and we know who's on Fox, who's on MS, who's on CNN, what they're saying on Twitter and Facebook?
Yeah, I mean, it's not as though we've never had the opportunity to express opinions before. It's just that in the past, we've limited those opinions to the op-ed pages. And that's no longer the case. And that, I think, is a step in the wrong direction. I don't really like seeing analysis pieces on the front page of a major newspaper. I think they belong in the back on one of the op-ed pages.
And so you think that cable TV news in some ways has undermined objective journalism?
Well, I think cable TV news in many respects, look, obviously what happened is the first to do it was Rupert Murdoch over at Fox, and it became hugely profitable. You know, you may know the numbers better than I do, but I think Fox these days probably earns about $1.5 billion a year. That's real money. And at the time when Fox started doing that, MSNBC was nowhere, doing nothing, making zero. And it is only when the folks over at NBC decided that they were going to turn MSNBC into a liberal counterpart to what Fox was doing, that they started really improving their ratings and therefore also improving the amount of money they were making.
Do you think that democracy is getting undermined by the fact that people are getting their news and information from more partisan and ideological sources?
I don't think democracy is being strengthened by it. Is it being undermined? Yes. I think that a democracy requires, desperately needs, what are widely perceived by people of all political stripes as objective sources of news. Otherwise, it's too easy to dismiss what is being said by one side or the other simply because they don't share your political point of view. You know, that doesn't mean that network news or cable news or the major newspapers cannot be very tough in terms of the reporting they do. But I don't think their reporters should be perceived as siding with one group rather than the other. I think that does undermine democracy, yes.
Isn't it true, though, that some stories can be true and that maybe journalists shouldn't be saying on the one hand and on the other hand, they should be saying this is just the objective truth?
I totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. I mean, it used to frustrate the hell out of me, Walter, when I would see people going out and doing man-in-the-street interviews, one side for, one against, and one not sure. That's not journalism. Journalism requires that you have the capacity to at least lay out the facts so that your readers, your audience, can then draw their own conclusions. And when the laying out of facts looks like an indictment, I don't have any problem with that.
To what extent do you think that the internet and social media has exacerbated this problem?
Hugely, hugely. I mean, I think the internet has been, the internet is on one level one of the greatest gifts to mankind that we can imagine. On another level, it is a weapon of mass destruction. It is the internet that has enabled people of extreme ideologies on the left and on the right to get in touch, not just with the half a dozen people sitting at the bar who may share their opinion, but all of a sudden, anyone with access to a laptop, anyone with access to an iPhone, has the capacity of becoming a publisher, a broadcaster, someone who potentially can reach hundreds, thousands. When you and I were young journalists, if you wanted to reach a large audience, you had to work for ABC or the New York Times or the Associated Press or UPI. It wasn't possible for an individual to put something out and make sure that it would reach tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people at a time. The internet makes that possible. That is both a blessing and a curse.
But isn't it, in some ways, not just a blessing, but it really democratizes, as opposed to allowing gatekeepers like you and I once were to say, here's the news?
Yeah, and if you think the democratization of journalism is a good thing, I disagree with you. I don't
Why?
think it is. Because whether, you wouldn't dream of democratizing any other profession. You wouldn't democratize medicine. You wouldn't democratize the law. You wouldn't democratize plumbing or carpentry. You expect a certain level of expertise. You expect a carpenter to have had some training in his trade. I expect a journalist to have had some training in his trade. By the democratization of journalism, you make the process available to people who have absolutely no background in trying to present a fair, balanced point of view. None. So in that sense, obviously we like to think that democracy is in and of itself an unimpeachable word. If something is democratic, it has to be good. Not necessarily so.
Do you think there's any way that the country gets back to what I guess you and I would call the old normal?
No. None. Not a chance.
So how does this movie go?
Well, I think we can only express a hope, a prayer even, that it doesn't go in the direction of violence. On one level, and I'm not the first to say this and won't be the last, we clearly are already engaged in a sort of ideological civil war in this country. For the time being, it has been waged with at least a minimum of bloodshed.
You've been a pretty bleak assessment of where we are and how it could get worse. In some ways, people have compared this to sort of an authoritarian tumult, even the way it was in Germany in the 1930s. Is that comparison in any way valid?
I don't think so. No, I mean, there is still, and I hope to God that we can defend it. There is still something unique about America and the many voices. I mean, so far at least, that's why it bothered me so much when some people on the left began talking early on about the resistance. And when I think about the resistance, I think about courageous Germans in Nazi Germany who were confronting the possibility of imprisonment, torture, death. I think about the French resistance to Nazi Germans who occupied France during World War II. We're nowhere near that in this country yet. And no, I don't see that yet. Is it possible? We are not immune to the laws of history. And if we give up our protections, if we no longer value the rule of law and the appropriateness of journalism that is much heavier on objectivity than it is on opinion. If we don't value those things appropriately, then I fear not that we're going to become Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, but it's not going to be a happy place. And we have seen periods like that in this country. The McCarthy era, people lived in fear of expressing honest opinions out loud. So we've come dangerously close in the past, and I think we are at least in a position today where it's not beyond the question, I mean, it's not beyond possibility that we could slide more in that direction. But do I see a precise parallel with Nazi Germany? I do not.
Ted Koppel, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.